Hello, this is your host of PoliTalks, Eric Hacopian, and we're honored to have as our guest today Samson Avetian. Mr. Avetian is a managing director of Avetian Company, a macro research firm. He's the co-founder of and vice president of Angel Investors of Armenia, and an adjunct lecturer of economics at the American University of Armenia. Mr. Avetian is a graduate of Harvard Business School and a former president of the Harvard Club of Armenia. For those who didn't know there was such a thing, you're living proof that there is. Welcome to our show, Mr. Avetian.
Thank you.
You have recently written a very interesting book, which is called Armenia's Economy for the Next 25 Years. I want to give you an opportunity to sort of give a layman's explanation of what's in the book, what is stressed, and what are you trying to say?
Yeah, so as the title says, I've in essence looked back in the last 25 years, basically since the independence of Armenia, and tried to kind of, the project was oriented towards a couple of objectives. One of them was to register the progress that we've had. Register progress meaning comparative to other countries. So there's a lot of talk, this is this economic growth, that growth, GDP this, GDP that. You have to have everything in perspective. So one of the objectives was to compare how have we done versus other countries. Second thing was that I wanted to move from narratives towards data. So it's all very heavily data-driven, not meaning it's not statistics heavy, it's statistics to underbuild any argument that is made. So that's the use of statistics and moving from narrative and opinions towards some kind of more standard approach used by investment banks, rating agencies, and so on. So that's the approach taken. And the third objective was across these 2 decades, more or less, we have kind of lived in a fairly unsustainable economic model. I'll go into that in detail a bit later. But in essence, we've seen this before. Armenia is a fairly young country, so which means that a lot of developing countries try to move from developing to developed country status. Most of them fail. And we've kind of coming to a crossroads, I would say, gradually when this sustainable economic model needs to change. We have to make decisions, make reforms. The book is written 2016 was finished 2018. So that was done before, obviously, the Velvet Revolution, but it doesn't diminish the issues that we need to deal with in any way.
Well, I want to talk about, you said sustainable. What is not sustainable in your view? If you put your finger on, what are the specifics of what is not sustainable? So
the key issue is, across most of these 20 years, we have consumed above our production. So we produced maybe for $80 of value and consumed at 100. And the difference is the $20, right? And where has these $20 come from? First, they came from transfers, so we shipped crudely people abroad, they send the money, we consumed. Then we started taking on loans and credits from multilateral institutions, IMF, World Bank, and so on. And in recent years, we also started to take, let's say, private external debt to finance our purchases. So it's like going into a store and not having the money to pay. How do you purchase the stuff above what you have to pay? That's credit. And that's what has gone on for more or less 2 decades, even more. And again, we have seen this before, and we need to kind of make decisions. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but in coming years, definitely we need to address this.
Well, I think let's play the devil's advocate here. I don't think anybody will doubt that there's plenty of economic problems with this country. But at the same time, you look at our neighbors, different kinds of countries, different religions, background, different economic models, political models. And this is the one country where you have a fairly stable currency, you have low inflation, you have a stable banking system, and over the last 2 or 3 years at least, you've had significant growth numbers compared to the countries around us. First of all, is that sustainable? And second of all, why is this dichotomy between us and our neighbors when they have so many more advantages?
Well, I wouldn't say Turkey's economic model is anyway for us exemplary to us. I wouldn't say neither is our southern neighbors' model. I'm not comparing ourselves to Azerbaijan because we have totally different, let's say, endowments and economic and political model. So, which leaves us only Georgia to compare. Let's put it that way. With regard to Georgia, maybe there's a lot of things. They had their change, let's say, 15 years ago. We had our change last year. While all of that is very positive in the long run, legal reforms, let's say, mandate for change, elections, property rights, all that is very good. But if you look at, for example, GDP per capita in Georgia and Armenia, they're more or less exactly the same 15 years ago as they are today. The external debt level is higher in Georgia. I'm not saying what they have done is not good. It's very good. It's the most important thing you need to do in the long run to reach to advanced country level. But you need to do something. What I'm trying to say, you need to do something else as well. Mm-hmm. You cannot leave all of that and say that's fine and we're going to get there someday. Mm-hmm. You have to do more, let's say, economic reforms, supply-side reforms, productivity enhancements, oriented policies, and so on. So it's really good what we've done. We need to do more. That's
how much of that argument. Do you think? I don't disagree with you, by the way. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. How much do you think that involves in? You said we don't produce enough. Is to move towards things that are really not preached by the international agencies, IMF and others, World Bank, which is import substitution, do more production here, even if it's not totally competitive worldwide. Is that what you mean by producing more? Is that what you mean by producing more?
So we need to, so one of the things the book analyzes, it kind of goes through different sectors of the economy. I'm in no way saying that what the World Bank or IMF is suggesting, advising, and so on are not good. They are very good policies most of the time and very relevant. The thing is, I wouldn't advise policies on import substitution. I would rather say, do something you're good at, leave the other stuff for the rest to do. We don't need to grow cotton in this country. We don't need to do many other things that are unproductive. You need to do stuff you're good at. And the problem for Armenia, there are a lot of bottlenecks. If you want to do manufacturing, the problem is obviously the logistics, the borders, plus what is very little talked about, there's absence of supply chains. What I mean is that if you want to produce a phone or a TV, you need to bring all of that stuff from very far, like Taiwan, Asia, and stuff like that. So imagine the cost involved. So those are the issues that are very difficult to solve, and you need to understand how do we solve these bottlenecks.
One of the things is, obviously you speak about the issue of debt, and what's discussed recently is this $500 million balloon payment of debt, which was rolled over from 2009. Isn't the best antidote for the debt to economy ratio, economic growth, i.e. isn't the best way to deal with our debt problem is not to have a Greek-type clank down on spending, but rather try to grow your way out of it and then limit future debt? Is that the approach you would recommend?
Yes, that's exactly it. Because one of the things is, if you're an advanced country, that means you've basically utilized all of your potential that's lying there, and you need to innovate, right? So if you're US, if you're France, if you're Spain, if you have adapted all of the best practices, let's say governance, public administration, I don't know, corporate governance and so on, the only stuff remains is trying to innovate to find a new medicine, the new iPhone, and so on and so forth. In our case, there's so much stuff we can adopt, best practices, whether it's technology, public administration, whatever. All of that stuff raises your potential GDP, which means you have tons of potential to make sure that this debt issue is not a problem at all. Your GDP has a lot of potential, and basically you just need to unlock it. You don't need to innovate, you need to adopt the best practice.
You mentioned the fact that, your book was written prior to the revolution. We've obviously had the revolution, and I know a lot of people in the economic sphere are, some are quite critical of the current government, some are, passively optimistic, some are very optimistic. How would you grade the current government's economic policies or vision, or frankly, if they have one? How would you grade what they have done, or what you think they want to do, and how successful do you think they have been or can be based on precedents?
So if you look at the approaches, at the speeches, at the policies adopted, they're fairly easy to kind of place them in a certain place in the political, let's say, spectrum. These are individual freedom, individual responsibility, you make the decision. It's free markets, it's individual responsibility. And it's kind of easy to place that in a traditional political spectrum. So that's good, and that's commendable. The issue is, the question is whether that's enough. And is it enough to make sure the legal stuff works, the property right, all of that is enough? Or has Armenia so many other bottlenecks that need to be solved so you can do this and ignore the bottleneck issues? I would again argue that we need to solve the other bottlenecks as well. And also regarding the economic growth and prospects, I would try to, I'll mention a couple things. First of all, as I mentioned previously, you need to adopt best practices and best technologies. And I sense a change in approach here. People are trying, or the policymakers are trying to get ahead, try to get to the frontiers, try to adopt as much as possible. And do that also, I'd emphasize in national interests. I see much more commitment to national interest that I saw before. Those are 2 points. The other 2 points I'll make is economic growth. A lot of times when it's talked, it's about this quarter's growth versus that quarter's growth, and this has contracted by 5.7% or whatever, or grown by 6.9%.
Not relevant.
Yeah. So the short-term stuff is very difficult to impact for any policymaker, especially in a country like Armenia, because it's an open economy, a small economy. Most of the stuff we rely on are commodity exports, transfer that are based on commodities, loans we take abroad. So it's either commodity prices or financial stability abroad. Neither of those can a policymaker in Armenia impact, which means the only stuff you can work on is the longer run issues. And the longer run issues, I'd be far more optimistic here, saying that in the longer run, all the stuff that is being done is really good. So you're increasing your structural growth. In the short run, the financial stability issues, unfortunately, the political comings and goings do have an impact on people's expectations, people's kind of comfort in making investment decisions. For good or bad, that's seen everywhere in any country. So those kind of issues can have a kind of a dampening effect in the short run.
I want to ask you something that I always like to talk about things that people don't focus on, because there's so much of economics is people are used to talking about the same things. But for someone who's here and someone who's been in the business world and someone who's been in the investment world, tell me, what is it on the positive and what is it on the negative level about the Armenian economy that is not widely known? What is it that people don't know that could be beneficial to an outside investor, or what is it that is not known that could be a negative to an outside investor?
To an outside investor, I'd put it this way. Why would Armenia be of any interest to an outside larger investor? Usually small countries not of interest because the market is small. So if you want to sell something, it's a small market, the disposable income is very small, which means small countries usually are open for trade, and you use them as an export platform. Now then you have to understand, okay, if we're going to have an export platform in this country, what are we going to export? Again, you go through the different sectors and understand that some have bottlenecks, some have issues. What are the sectors that are of interest? Primarily, I would say it's IT and tech that are of most potential, because here we can use, we don't need the roads, we don't need a lot of, we're basically circumventing a lot of the bottlenecks, and here we have tons of potential. And you also see the numbers. If you look at the sectors and which sectors export, which sectors have difficulties, even in tourism that we kind of pride ourselves of being strong in, tourism is in deficit, which means we kind of import more tourist services than export it. So which means, so these are the things that IT and tech are very important, a lot of potential. The negative side, I think people in Armenia, the pinpointing of expectations, of the impact expectations play on people's behavior, whether it's an investor, a businessman, or a consumer, are very large. And I think we kind of forget that a bit, that has an impact. So those are the two things that are not talked about as much.
Well, I was you sort of answered my next question, which was the why. I call it the why Armenia question. I'm not Armenian. I'm just an international business person. Why come here when I can go to 75 different places that have myriad of different advantages? But one thing you touched on is a bigger market, and something that's not talked about, because I think a lot of people don't like how it came about, was the whole EEE issue, the Eurasian Economic Union. Obviously, that in many people's perception is a poor man's EU, but however, it's there, and on paper, it allows you to go to a market of not 2 to 3 million people, but something approaching 150, 200 million people. How real is that? To what extent can that be marketed, or is it entirely irrelevant?
So, okay, if we compare the two markets, so one has to understand there's a certain political tinge to all of this, military and geopolitics and so on. If you just look at the economics of it, if you just compare the EU versus Eurasian Union, on disposable income per person is far higher in the EU. So GDP per capita is higher, which means people have a lot more money to pay for your products. That's one thing. Plus, if you look at the size, I think it's close to 500 million of inhabitants in EU.
Much wealthier.
Yeah, much wealthier, many more than, let's say, 150 here. And thirdly, if you're a developing country, you need to learn a lot. You need to adopt the best practices, best policies, the corporate governance stuff, the technology, and all of that stuff. Now, if you go into a union that's far more knowledge sharing than you would imagine in any customs union or any, let's say, semi-political union like EU or Eurasian Union. So if you want to learn the best practices, you kind of make a decision there where you want to go. Plus, if you look at the industrial structure of the economy, what are these countries really good at? And what is it Armenia can take away from this? Most of the countries are oriented towards mining, oil, gas, commodities, and stuff like that. Certain sectors are competitive, obviously. In Russia, let's say, aerospace, military, space. Some sectors are indeed competitive. Is there anything Armenia can use from those sectors? That's the question. But that would be my approach to answering that question.
What is your opinion? Is it just is it a fool's venture, or is it something there that can be useful to the country at this point?
I'd say you have to make the most of it. It's mostly a political decision as opposed to an economic one.
You obviously, what is the, much gets talked about the regulatory environment of doing business here, and you hear entirely contradictory things. On the one hand, you'll see reports it's one of the fastest countries to set up a business with. On the other hand, you'll talk to attorneys who'll tell you, no, it's not. You're better off incorporating someplace else because of tax rules, other rules. What are the regulatory issues for someone doing business here that stand out if you're coming here? What are the biggest problems, and what are the advantages, if any, in the regulatory systems here compared to other places?
So, in essence, I'd say a regulation is usually works to the detriment of a business person. If you hear any economic discourse or discussion in the U.S., regulation is bad for business. And obviously, of course, it limits the opportunity set. It also increases the cost for a business. That's one thing. The second thing is, changing regulations are also very negative, because any business needs to forecast when it makes an investment. Now, when regulation changes, your costs change, your admin changes, and all of that stuff. With regard to Armenia specifically, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, regulations can be reactive or proactive. What I'm trying to say is that reactive is when you're saying you cannot do this and you cannot do that. Let's say mining, we cannot do mining anymore, we need to do something else. That's fine. Or we cannot have cafes in this neighborhood because the building rights were not proper, and so on. One has to understand that stuff limits economic growth, for good or bad. I'm not trying to kind of argue for mining, but if you want to do that, that's fine. My suggestion would be try to phase that in, so that doesn't become a shock. Give them time for this businessman to kind of bring back some of their investment, obviously, try to reorient themselves, and so that's not drastic, because drastic things are kind of not good for investment climate. And the second thing, what I'm talking about proactive, is countries try to push their business in a certain orientation, a certain direction. So let's say UK, France, they're trying to move through electric vehicles, trying to do renewable energy. What that does is it forces the business to change, but when you force the business to change, they become competitive for the future. So we're doing a lot of this stuff, the reactive stuff. We need to do things proactively as well to prepare your businesses to be competitive in the future. Obviously, it's not an easy thing to do, but we kind of need to start thinking that way as well. So reactive, proactive, and try to phase things in, because that you would get better economic outcomes that way.
Well, I want to finish up our talk with a sort of a personal question, because you're obviously a very successful person, and you could have been successful anywhere. You decided to move back to Armenia about 10 years ago to do business here. What brought you back?
So, three things I'd mention. Firstly, I was fortunate enough that the business I wanted to do back then, I was able to do that here. So that was the one thing. And I also wanted to kind of have there was a life quality issue as well. So first one, the business type, life quality. And third thing is, obviously this country has gone through a lot of difficulties, and all of us, including myself, need to have some kind of contribution to its development. We have a difficult history. We had difficult times in the 90s, and we have an opportunity, so we need to make the most of it.
Well, I wanted to thank you for being our host, for being our guest, and I want to urge all of our viewers to get a chance at buying this book. It's exceptional as far as the economic issues that it covers. Thank you for being on our show.
Thank you, Eric.